The sound of artillery thundered across the battlefield as smoke rose from burning villages scattered across the horizon. But among the chaos and destruction, something unprecedented was happening. For the first time in military history, women were stepping into roles that would forever change the face of warfare. These weren't just support roles or auxiliary positions. These were women carrying rifles, flying bombers through enemy fire, and leading charges that would determine the fate of nations. Throughout history, we've been told stories of great warriors and legendary battles. We've memorized the names of generals and celebrated the victories of armies. But there's been a massive gap in these stories, a deliberate omission that has hidden some of the most remarkable acts of courage and tactical brilliance ever recorded. The women who fought, who bled, who died for their countries have been erased from our collective memory, relegated to footnotes in dusty history books that few people ever read. What if I told you that some of the most feared pilots in World War II were teenage girls flying rickety wooden planes? What if I revealed that a peasant teenager once convinced a king to give her an army and then proceeded to change the course of European history? What if you discovered that in modern conflicts happening right now, women are commanding artillery units, shooting down cruise missiles, and leading drone squadrons with deadly precision? The reality is that women have been warriors for thousands of years across every continent, in every major conflict, fighting with weapons ranging from ancient swords to cutting-edge military technology. Yet somehow, their stories have been buried beneath centuries of assumption and deliberate historical revision. Tonight, we're going to uncover these stories, and what you'll discover will completely reshape how you understand warfare itself. Let me start with something that will blow your mind. In ancient Scythian society, nearly 40% of warrior graves contained the remains of women. These weren't ceremonial burials or symbolic gestures. Archaeological evidence shows battle wounds, weapons designed for their hands, and armor crafted specifically for female bodies. The legendary Amazons that the Greeks wrote about weren't mythical creatures from fantasy tales. They were real women who rode horses, shot arrows with deadly accuracy, and struck fear into the hearts of the most powerful armies of their time. But this wasn't limited to one culture or one time period. In medieval Wales, a woman named Gwenllian Ferch Gruffydd didn't just support her husband's rebellion against Norman invaders. When he was away seeking allies, she took command of his forces and led them into battle herself. She died fighting, sword in hand, but her courage inspired an entire nation to continue the fight for their freedom. Meanwhile, in ancient Macedonia, Cynaen was busy earning recognition as one of the most formidable warriors of her generation. As the half-sister of Alexander the Great, she could have lived a life of luxury and political maneuvering. Instead, she chose the battlefield, leading troops to victory after victory, proving that tactical brilliance and physical courage weren't exclusively male traits. The pattern repeats across every continent and every era. In the Islamic world, women like Nusaybah bint Ka'ab fought alongside the Prophet Muhammad himself, suffering wounds that would have killed lesser warriors while continuing to fight. Khawla bint al-Azwar became legendary for her cavalry charges, often disguising herself as a male warrior before revealing her identity after achieving victory. Even in the Americas, long before European contact, women were leading armies and founding kingdoms. Yeninga, a warrior princess, became so skilled in combat that she founded the Mossi kingdoms, ruling through military might and strategic brilliance. In the Toltec civilization, Queen Xochitl led an entire battalion of female warriors in a civil war that shaped the future of Mesoamerica. These weren't isolated incidents or exceptional cases. They represent a consistent pattern throughout human history that has been systematically ignored or deliberately suppressed. Women have always fought in wars. They have always been capable of the same courage, the same tactical thinking, and the same deadly effectiveness as their male counterparts. So why don't we know these stories? Why have they been erased from our understanding of military history? The answer lies in who gets to write the history books and whose stories get told. For centuries, military historians were predominantly men writing for male audiences, focusing on male commanders and male soldiers. The contributions of women were either overlooked entirely or dismissed as anomalies that didn't fit the accepted narrative of warfare. This historical amnesia has had devastating consequences for how we understand human nature itself. We've built entire societies around the assumption that women are naturally less aggressive, less capable of violence, less suited for leadership in high-stakes situations. These assumptions have been used to justify excluding women from combat roles, from military leadership positions, and from the full spectrum of human capability. But what happens when we actually look at the evidence? What happens when we examine the archaeological records, read the first-hand accounts, and analyze the military effectiveness of female warriors throughout history? The picture that emerges is radically different from everything we've been taught. Take the case of Joan of Arc, probably the most famous female warrior in Western history. But even her story has been sanitized and mythologized to the point where we've lost sight of what actually happened. Joan wasn't just a mystical figure guided by divine voices. She was a brilliant military strategist who understood siege warfare, troop morale, and battlefield tactics better than most of the experienced commanders of her time. When she arrived at the court of Charles VII, she wasn't just some peasant girl with religious delusions. She had studied military strategy, understood the political situation in France, and had developed a comprehensive plan for defeating the English forces that had been dominating French territory for decades. Her success at the Siege of Orleans wasn't a miracle. It was the result of careful planning, innovative tactics, and exceptional leadership under pressure. But here's the part of Joan's story that really matters. She was 17 years old when she convinced a king to give her command of an army. Think about that for a moment. A teenage girl walked into the court of one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe and persuaded him that she could succeed where his experienced generals had failed. And then she actually did it. The victory at Orleans wasn't just a military triumph. It was a psychological earthquake that shattered English confidence and restored French morale. Joan had proven that the English weren't invincible, that their siege tactics could be countered, and that French forces could not only resist, but actually drive the invaders back across the Channel. This is where the story gets really interesting, because Joan's success reveals something crucial about leadership and military effectiveness that challenges our most basic assumptions about gender and warfare. The qualities that made Joan successful as a military commander weren't traditionally masculine traits, like physical strength or aggressive dominance. They were strategic thinking, the ability to inspire troops, understanding of logistics and supply lines, and the courage to make difficult decisions under extreme pressure. These are exactly the qualities that define effective military leadership in any era, and they have nothing to do with gender. Joan succeeded because she was brilliant, not because she was male or female. Her gender was irrelevant to her tactical abilities, her leadership skills, and her effectiveness in combat situations. The same pattern emerges when we look at other female military leaders throughout history. Their success wasn't despite their gender or because they were somehow exceptional women. They succeeded because they possessed the intellectual and emotional qualities that effective military leadership requires, qualities that are distributed equally among men and women. This brings us to one of the most remarkable military units in modern history, a group of women whose exploits were so extraordinary that their enemies gave them a nickname that has echoed through the decades. They called them the Night Witches, and the name wasn't meant as a compliment. German soldiers cowering in their trenches on the Eastern Front whispered the term in fear and grudging respect. These were Soviet female pilots who flew the most dangerous missions of World War II. And they did it in aircraft that were basically flying coffins held together with canvas and prayer. The story begins with Marina Raskova, a woman who had already become a folk hero in the Soviet Union for her aviation achievements in the 1930s. When Germany invaded in 1941, hundreds of women approached Raskova begging for the chance to fight. They weren't asking for safe roles behind the lines. They wanted to fly combat missions, to drop bombs on German positions, to shoot down enemy aircraft. Raskova did something unprecedented. She went directly to Stalin himself and convinced him to authorize the formation of 3 all-female aviation regiments. Think about that for a moment. In a military culture that was notoriously male-dominated, in the middle of the most brutal war in human history, Stalin agreed to let women fly combat missions against the Luftwaffe. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment became the most famous of these units, and their tactics were absolutely insane. They flew in Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes, aircraft that were originally designed for training pilots and crop dusting. These weren't sleek fighters or heavily armored bombers. They were fabric-covered planes with open cockpits, maximum speeds that barely exceeded 100 miles per hour, and no defensive armament whatsoever. The women developed a technique that sounds like something from a fantasy novel, but was devastatingly effective in practice. They would approach German positions at night, cut their engines near the target, and glide silently toward their bombing points. The only sound was wind rushing over the wings, a whisper in the darkness that German soldiers learned to fear more than the roar of heavy bombers. German troops said the sound reminded them of broomsticks flying through the air, which is how these women earned their legendary nickname. But there was nothing supernatural about their effectiveness. They flew over 23,000 combat sorties, dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs, and delivered 26,000 incendiary shells directly onto German positions. The numbers tell only part of the story. Many of these pilots flew over 800 missions by the end of the war. To put that in perspective, most bomber crews in other air forces were considered lucky to survive 25 missions. These women were flying into combat night after night, month after month, year after year, with casualty rates that would have broken most military units. 23 of them were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor in the country. 32 died in combat. They weren't just participating in the war effort. They were among the most elite and effective combat pilots on either side of the conflict. What made them so successful? It wasn't just their courage, though they had that in abundance. It was their tactical innovation, their understanding of psychological warfare, and their ability to turn the limitations of their aircraft into advantages. The Germans had radar systems designed to detect fast-moving metal aircraft. The Night Witches flew slowly in fabric planes that barely registered on enemy detection systems. German fighter pilots found it almost impossible to engage the Po-2s effectively. The biplanes flew too slowly for fighters to attack without stalling their own engines. Anti-aircraft guns had difficulty tracking targets that moved at such low speeds and could change direction instantly. The women had turned their apparent disadvantages into tactical superiority. But here's what really matters about the Night Witches. They proved definitively that women could not only perform in combat aviation, but excel at it under the most extreme conditions imaginable. They flew in aircraft without parachutes, without radio communication, without any of the safety equipment that other air forces considered essential. They navigated by landmarks in complete darkness, calculated bombing runs by instinct and experience, and returned to base through weather that grounded other aircraft. The Soviet Union wasn't just experimenting with female pilots. They were fielding the most effective night bombing unit on the Eastern Front, and it happened to be composed entirely of women. This wasn't about equal opportunity or progressive politics. This was about military effectiveness, pure and simple. The same principle applies to Soviet female snipers, another group of women whose combat effectiveness shattered every assumption about gender and warfare. Between 1941 and 1945, over 2,000 Soviet women served as snipers on the front lines. Their combined kill count exceeded 11,000 confirmed enemy soldiers. Lyudmila Pavlichenko became the most successful female sniper in military history, with 309 confirmed kills. Rosa Shanina was credited with over 50 kills before she died in combat at age 20. These weren't women playing supportive roles or filling gaps in the rear echelon. These were elite combat specialists performing one of the most psychologically demanding roles in warfare. The stories we've uncovered tonight reveal a truth that has been hidden for far too long. From ancient battlefields to modern drone operations, women have always possessed the courage, intelligence, and deadly effectiveness that warfare demands. The Night Witches, Joan of Arc, the Soviet snipers, and the Ukrainian artillery commanders all prove the same fundamental point. Military excellence has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with skill, determination, and the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than yourself. These women didn't fight to prove a political point. They fought because their nations needed them, and they answered that call with the same honor and effectiveness as any warrior in history.